The title of this panel is In the Guise of Democracy. Whoever thought up that title, it's a very, very clever title. And why is that? What does guise mean? Are we hiding from something? Is there some kind of a charade going on? To answer the question about that and democracy, are we hiding our democracy, or is it hiding from us somehow? To answer that question, we have two extraordinarily talented panelists. David, as you all have met many times over, has a long, long history of dealing with social action and dealing with democracy. And it's always a pleasure to see him. He's been on many panels with many of us here. Thank you very much again. You got recruited this morning. Jenna Griswold is relatively new to all of this as the most recently elected Secretary of State in the state of Colorado in terms of that wonderful wave that came in 2018, a lawyer and a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania. So they're going to help us answer this question. I think we would all agree that the ill winds are blowing related to democracy. And we want to think about that and think about it hard. Our founding fathers knew their history very well. Aristotle, who warned that inequality brought instability. Plato, who believed that demagogues exploited free speech to install themselves as tyrants. The founding fathers founded a democratic republic, not a pure democracy, a democratic republic, based upon law, checks and balances, the rule of law, independent judiciary, and the ability of people to have a voice separate from the executive. And our history, in many ways, is a history of battles about that particular dynamism, and a battle about tyranny, a battle about those who attempted to circumvent the rules that were set up for government and to use the government for their own particular purposes. In the lifetimes of many in this room, we have seen major democracies come and in fact fade away. We just finished a 100-year anniversary of World War I, and right after World War I was an explosion of democratic impulse in Germany, which was stolen away by Hitler. After World War II, there was another explosion of democratic impulse all across Eastern Europe, stolen away by Stalin and the communists. And after the collapse of communism, we saw another rise of the possibilities of democracy and democratic institutions stolen away in large part by Putin. So what's happened? We cannot take liberal democracy and these institutions for granted. Just in our lifetimes or our near lifetimes, we have seen democratic institutions come and democratic institutions go. Think about what's going on around the world. What happened in Egypt, what's happened in Vietnam, Hungary, Turkey, Brazil. Autocrats have come into power, hijacking the courts, destroying political opposition, muzzling the press, and undermining democracies and the liberal values that we have all thought we could take for granted. Does all of this sound familiar? It should, because we are in battle. The ill winds for democracy are blowing across this country, and we have to, one, recognize the fact that this is happening, and then once recognizing that and think about it seriously, and thinking about the hard work of democracy and self-government, start to act. David has done some of the best work in the country of thinking about how we go about repairing our democracy. Over to you.
Senator, thank you. It's a real honor to be with you on the program. Jenna, great to meet you, and I've heard so many good things about you, and it's great to have you on the panel. I'm going to be fairly brief because time is short here, but let me start with this. There is a dialogue democracy is dying or not. And we didn't have in Academy, which I represented until retirement a year and a half ago, there really wasn't much concern about democracy. We assumed it was sound, it would be here, and I think the same is true in foundations. Those of you from foundations didn't set up democracy programs because it was assumed that we solved that problem. This slide says otherwise. And begin to look at the nature of the way we conduct the public business. We are not a representative democracy, even at that minimal level the founders set. So it's a little bit like, and you can read the slide, it's a little bit like standing on one side of the, say, Grand Canyon, where public opinion would support many of the things that all of us want in this room and across the country, but the policies, laws, and regulations that we get don't happen. And so the bridge is broken, or it's been turned into a toll bridge. And some of the best work in political science and public affairs is represented by the data on that slide. This is the Economist Index. Are we a democracy? Well, we now rank as a flawed democracy. And by every account, Freedom House and The Economist and four or other rating agencies have us slipping south pretty fast. This is, we're in the box on the right. And we are slipping, support for democracy is slipping across all liberal democracies. And virtually in every age demographic, every income distribution, our support, when the question is asked, is it important to live in a democracy? Fewer and fewer people now say, yes, it is. Part of the reason is this. We don't have time to get into what I think are the nest of reasons around this, but part of the reason is this. By cohort, at every 10 years, your chances of doing well in this economy decline relative to that of your parents. And so we used to be an opportunity society. We now compare badly on almost every opportunity index. Then there's gerrymandering. Let's just put our district up here. Jim Jordan, our congressperson, who is about as far right as anybody in Congress. He is kind of the poster child for right-wing politics. This is how his district is gerrymandered. To keep him in office, that's how you have to do it. And so states have gerrymandered. It's not just a Democratic Republican thing. Both parties do it, but the Republicans got especially good at it. This is a map of the United States. We're red, we're purple, but the blue islands are mostly urban areas. So Democrats and progressives now live increasingly in urban states. By 2040, half will live in 8 states. And what that means is that 30% of the voters will choose 70% of the senators, or 70 senators. That's no longer a democracy. That means rule by urban, rural people. And so think of the Supreme Court and the way the Supreme Court and decisions that have to go through the Senate get blocked. Mitch McConnell by name. Now, I want to ask a question, so what? There are people in the room and elsewhere that have been largely indifferent to the issue, and there is an argument to be made for, let's say, government by expertise. Let's just have experts rule this. 2 arguments I want to put out that we should be concerned about. This is Jim Hansen, the leading climate scientist in the world, a guy who testified for Senator Worth, your committee it was in 1988. Jim Hansen's credibility is impeccable. As he's gone through his career, he's come to the view that we have to repair democracy to fix climate change. That the way we conduct the public machinery has got to engage the public. Government really of, by, and for the people. Here's a second reason. I'm going to put this out. This will be controversial. But the thing I worry about in audiences like this, mostly technical skills, financial skills, and this very, very talented group, but I worry about the possibility that we could create a solar-powered, hyper-efficient, resilient, sustainable, fascist society. Now, I've got to define fascism, so that's the second paragraph. And if you read that carefully, that pretty much reflects the headlines we see now in most of the press. Mendacity, lying, misogyny, corporate tax evasion, on and on. You go down the list of things that Bill Becker describes so well. What do we do about it? This is one answer to it. It is not the answer, simply an answer to try to get a foothold on these issues. This is a hotel we built in Oakland. This is the last thing I did before I was retired. But in that hotel, we held a conference on the state of American democracy. in 2017, November 2017. The election, we're trying to absorb the effects of the election. What do we do? So for 3 days, we had 32 speakers over 3 days. We had Jane Mayer from New York. We ended with Reverend William Barber from North Carolina. One of the highlights for everybody who was there was we put Tim Weiner from the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration, on the platform with your former Governor Bill Ritter. And the people in evaluating, this we did after dinner, so there was no deadline. We didn't have to get them off the stage quickly. And you know what? You put a Republican, conservative, evangelical, and a liberal Democrat on the stage, you'd expect fireworks. Their assignment was to say what kind of changes they should make in liberalism or conservatism. And you know what? This was a civil conversation. It was a thoughtful conversation. Even had humor. And people later identified this as one of the highlights of the 3 days of talking. Democrats and Republicans can come together. We did it in the late 1960s to the late 1970s, when most of the environmental laws that are still on the books were passed. The conference went on. It was a wonderful event. That was Governor Schwarzenegger on the left and Tom Steyer, that's going to be here shortly. But the conversation crossed all kinds of boundaries. We can converse again about how we conduct a public business. You're doing that here in Colorado. Now I want to close with the current project. John Powers and I and some others of you in this room are engaged in a project, State of American Democracy by name. The website will go active in October. But we want to further a conversation, not specifically about the election of 2020. That's a sine qua non, obviously. But we want to further a conversation about how we repair and strengthen democratic institutions over the long haul. Because if we are to deal with the bubbles that Bill Becker described so well a moment ago, if we're to deal with those, this machinery of democracy has to work well, and it has to work for all of us. And I worry about the equity issues. I worry about the long-term foresight in the legislation, all the mechanics of democracy, and inequality is not the least of it. So this comes in 2 parts. The book, Democracy Unchained, comes out from the New Press in probably February of 2020. They've got the manuscript, and so it's in production. Most of the authors, about 2/3 of the authors are listed on the screen. Ganesh Sitaraman, Bill McKibben, Sabeel Rahman. I mean, there's quite a good group of authors. These are some of the best thinkers in constitutional law, politics, and journalism, and so forth. But we asked them to write original essays, keep them short, keep the footnotes minimal, so it's a readable book. But that's the basis then for a series of public events we want to do across the country. We want to get a debate, a discussion. We once did this from 1766 until 1790 in this country. We had a debate about how we conduct a public business, how you take all that we thought we learned from the Enlightenment, embody that in governing institutions. We want to start that debate. This isn't Democrat, it's not Republican. We have to deal with the flaws of both parties. In fact, the Republican Party has gone much further to the right than the Democrats have to the left. That's just one of the things that's built into the dialogue. But we'll start in March 25th, give or take, with the opening event at the National Cathedral in Washington, and then do events across the country with a number of organizations that the Alliance for Sustainable Colorado here in Denver, the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco, and 11 other places across the country. Then there's some other college events. But we want to start a dialogue. Let's talk again across the boundaries of the party and so forth. Now, this is my last slide. There is in this room and in this conversation a lot of preference given to markets, and I'm all for that. There's a lot of preference given to technology. I'm all for that. You can't be anti-market or anti-technology. The missing part of the dialogue here at AREDAY has been governance. How do we conduct a public business? To change the pronoun from I, me, and mine. That's what you say when you go to the market. To we, ours, and us, and include future generations and everybody. So this is the conversation we have to have. And James Madison said this in his great Federalist paper 51. We are not angels. We are flawed people. We are in organizations. Corruption will always be here. And the issues of transparency and fairness and a government that protects all the people fairly and decently. That's our goal. Thanks.
David Orworth. waiting for, certainly. Jenna, in the guise of democracy, how do we repair and how do we strengthen this democracy? You've just seen it right up front.
Yeah, so thank you, Senator. Thank you, David, for inviting me. I know you guys all applauded when the Senator said I was the Secretary of State, but just in case you don't know, the Secretary of State is a statewide elected official here in Colorado that oversees our elections, campaign finance, and business and charity registration. And you know, when we're talking about the 1% or who's making these decisions, I'm not the typical person who gets elected. I grew up in rural Colorado, but not quite like a town like this. You know, growing up, my mom would work 2 jobs, and there was still times when I vividly remember going to the Larimer County food banks. And I started working the summer after 7th grade up in Estes Park, and saw a lot of Colorado families struggling. That's why I was inspired to be the first in my family to go to a 4-year college, then to law school. And that's why it's so important to me that no matter whether you live or grew up in a town like me where there's more elk than people, whether you live in Denver, whether you're poor or richer, that you have your voice heard in our democracy. And I do think that as Secretary of State, what I am trying to do is making sure that all Coloradans, and frankly all Americans, have their voice heard. But what we see, and what I think that David really eloquently outlined, is what I see as a trifecta. A trifecta of voter suppression, and gerrymandering, and money in politics that makes it easier for elected officials to listen to special interests than their districts, than the people that they are elected to represent. And that's because there's a lot of money and there's a lot of influence and there's a lot of lobbyists saying, hey, my bottom line today is more important than our shared future. And to your point, mine versus we. And this is something that we are seeing across the nation, and this big money and this influence affects our ability to tackle climate change. It affects our ability to make sure that the beautiful lands that we have here in Snowmass and Aspen and across this great state remain intact in the future. Very luckily, Colorado is a national model of what democracy should look like. You know, for a while, we have been a model of voter accessibility and voter registration. You know, the fact that in Colorado you can register to vote online, you can register to vote early, you get a mail-in ballot, you can vote in person. There's so many ways to have access to the polls. That shines in stark contrast to the voter suppression we see across the nation. And when I ran for Secretary of State, and when I won this office, I didn't say we're starting from zero because we're already a national leader, but I did say we're going to expand on our successes. And I want to say Senator Foote is here. He's a state senator from northern Colorado, and he was my partner in leading the biggest democracy reform that we saw in this nation. We passed the Colorado Voting Act, which expands polling locations and drop boxes across the state, making it easier for working people to get to the polls, guaranteeing for the first time ever that we have polling locations and mail-in ballot drop boxes on public universities for students and on tribal lands for our native populations. We passed lobbyist reform so that lawyers, and I am a lawyer, they can't get crafty anymore and not disclose their clients. And then we passed one of the biggest campaign finance reforms in this nation, what I am extremely proud of, and Senator Foote was the person who ran it, that makes sure that we are shining light on the dark money, so that Coloradans know who's trying to send them all the messages that we hear around elections. We passed in that bill a requirement that corporations spending on ballot initiatives have to disclose to the people that they are sending those messages to you. And we then put an enforcement mechanism into the law so that not only is there a better set of rules, but we're enforcing it to make sure that special interests no longer get to sidestep the rules while all of us follow them. So we're
So as you all can see, we're on a roll here in the state of Colorado. So let me ask you a tough question, Jenna. Is the governor going to win in this battle related to fossil fuels and the fracking rules? Is it going to be possible to organize the environmental and the public health community in such a way to give him the support that he needs? We got to say, of course, the good guys are going to win.
Well, of course the good guys are going to be here, but I think if I had my crystal ball, I would probably be play in the stock market or something like that. But I would say, you know, democracy reform, we're really focused on democracy reform in Colorado. But to your point, there's a lot of different rules across this nation. In Colorado, it is just one state. In the power of money, the power of special interest, we need to have everybody work across this nation to make the playing field a little easier. So, you know, I do see social change as basically a triangle. You have to get people excited, then you have to get politicians excited. And how you get politicians excited is making sure you have good policy, but making sure that they're not going to lose their elections. Making sure that they know, hey, if I take this hard vote, it's no longer going to be a hard vote because it's the right thing to do. And the people in my district are going to like it. And the donors are going to support me. So I think we have really interesting things happening in Colorado where there's a lot of public support, lots of group support, and we shall see what happens.
Well, we got to win this one, Jeff. David, talk a little bit about, you know enough about, you know, what happens. We all have talked a lot about the fossil fuel community and their extraordinary power in American politics. Unprecedented, I think, in our nation's history. Not willing to give any of it up, and and generally very unwilling to share. How do we deal with that?
Well, we elect Jenna president, it seems to me, or Tom Steyer. Change the leadership. You know, it's a great question. The fossil fuel business is a $3 trillion a year business. Bill Becker had a slide on subsidies we give every year to fossil fuels. And I forgot the number, it's 500 and something billion per year. So the old attorney's rule of thumb is follow the money. And we've got, as Will Rogers said long ago, we've got the best Congress money could buy. So the answer is to take money out of politics. If you run for federal or state office, you cannot accept, we pay for it anyway. Just build it into the public funding mechanism. And that's said to be impossible, but at one point in our history, slavery was said to be, you know, abolition was said to be impossible. All these things were impossible. They're impossible until they're done. So my answer would be, we've got to deal with the issues, and the issues that Jenna said so well about. The core of gerrymandering is money. So ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, funded by the Koch brothers and other right-wing sources, basically writes the legislation in the state of Ohio. How convenient can that be? So they just passed House Bill 6 in Ohio to roll back our green energy standard. It supported 4 power plants, 2 nuclear and 2 coal-fired power plants, 1 in Indiana, at public expense. Isn't that cool? They were obsolete. And not only that, the legislature did not ask the utility, First Energy, to see the books that said that these are unprofitable. They asked for no evidence. So that's the power of money. And we're going to have real difficulty. It's a long-winded answer, but money is the root of the problem.
Yeah, I think there's a theme underlying all of this, or maybe overarching it all, and that's the morality of public policy and what we must do. It's one thing, you know, to say we're going to do this, we're going to worry about gerrymandering and campaign finance. But nothing's going to happen until people get together at the grassroots level and decide that they and their neighbor, they in their neighborhood, they in their local district are going to stand up. They're going to support local newspapers. They're going to start to propagate what the public health interest is. The public health interest is going to be extremely powerful, and it must be remembered. Remember what the public health in this industry is doing to children, what it's doing to pregnant mothers, what it's doing to the overall health of our society. Denver and Colorado are way out of whack, out of clean air rules. Why is that? Because of the fossil fuel industry. People are getting sicker and sicker and sicker. People have got to stand up and say that this is happening and create a real and legitimate movement. In our country, we have had movements on slavery, as you mentioned. We've had movements related to a variety of other issues. And we resolved those questions, or at least took them on, because we had that kind of grassroots political movement. And I happen to think that that's the single most important thing that we can and must do. That's going to be our way to skirt this tremendous power that's there and to begin to move on some of the challenges that Jenna's talking about. Jenna, let me ask you to respond to that. What do you think about building political movements?
Well, I obviously agree with that. I know you mentioned I came in on the blue wave, but I was also the first Democrat elected to Secretary of State since Dwight Eisenhower sat in the presidency. And it wasn't just blue wave, it was the indivisibles organizing. It was the fact that we had thousands of grassroots donors, of people concerned about democracy, and building that grassroots and building that energy is very important. But at the same time, the system is set up to put barriers in front of everyday people and make it easier for special interest corporations, billionaires, to have their voice heard. So I actually think we have to do both. And if there's any takeaway that I would urge you to think about, is democracy reform has to go hand in hand with solving the problems that we see. If we want solutions for climate change, we have to fix our broken democracy so that we can get our elected officials to look at facts and make fact-based decisions to assess what is the best thing for our future.
David, political movements in the country, is that part of what's going to be on the agenda? Are you going to be writing about that? Is that part of your overall democracy?
Yeah, when people say, we've described this to people, they say, oh, it sounds so partisan, or it sounds so liberal, or whatever. And you can't be nonpartisan, you can't be non-political. By being non-political, you're just supporting the status quo, you're supporting the other side. So there's no logical way to be non-political. So all of us are engaged in this. One thing I do worry about, we are, I'm told, exposed every day, all individually, we're exposed to something like 5,000 advertisements every day. And maybe that number is wrong by half, so let's say it's just 2,500. But every one of those messages say the same thing. If you want it, buy it. If it feels good, do it. If it itches, scratch it. So it's all about our role. But you don't see advertisements about the public interest. And the public interest, the idea of being a public servant, as Jenny is so well and so articulate with. People taking the public view of things, that's now seen as anathema. And it goes back to what the senator is saying too. The founding fathers were dubious about virtue. In the early years leading up to the writing of the Constitution, virtue was something that was expected. A certain amount of public spiritedness, big-heartedness, and neighborliness. And that's gone out. That's eroded by advertising. This constant focus on market solutions and fix it if you want it, buy it. I think we have to become better people. And we've got tough things ahead of us, hard decisions that will require, if we want to be part of it, all of us, we've got to improve how we intersect with this system we call democracy. It's worth defending.
And we are not alone in doing this, having this challenge. There are colleagues around the world, other countries, the Germans, the South Koreans, the French, the Japanese, in the UK, Taiwan, Mongolia, Ghana, countries that are facing exactly the same set of challenges about their liberal democratic institutions, and we must stick with them and ask to have leadership that sticks with them as well. Thank you all very much for being here. Go with feeling that we, in fact, have the opportunity to really make significant changes, and we will never give up. Thank you.
Thank you very much.